You may know a house, the old under-butlers used to say, by the way it speaks to the man carrying the tray. Not by its plate, and not by its candles, for anybody with money may buy those, but by what is said to the person whose whole office in the room is to be somewhere else in a moment. They said it as a caution to young men going into service, and it was generally heard as a complaint. It was, in fact, a very exact instrument, and in the winter of 1829, it took the measure of an entire county in the space of 4 hours. Vauncey stood 4 miles north of Marbury, on ground that fell away to the water meadows, and it was, in the January of that year, a great house being kept alive by 11 servants, doing the work of 31. The staterooms had been sheeted since the summer of the year 22. The gilding had gone dull in the long gallery, and nobody had touched it. There were 19 chimneys, and 4 of them drew. The lead had failed above the east front at some point in the previous decade, and the water came down inside the wall of the room where 9 generations of one family had hung their faces in oils, and pails stood under 2 of the portraits, and were emptied twice a day, in silence, by a woman who had been told not to remark on it. Verney emptied them. She was 26. She had come to Vauncey at 20 as an under-housemaid, and had risen, without anybody ever formally saying so, to the position of the person who actually did things, and she wore a gown the color a slate roof goes in rain, and her hands were cracked at the knuckles from cold water, and her eyes were grey and level and gave back precisely what they were given. She was up at 5:30 on the morning of the ball, as she was every morning, and she did the flues with a holly bough because the sweep charged 1 6, and a bough cost nothing, and she went along the gallery with a candle before the fires were lit, because a house tells the truth at that hour and at no other. There was to be a ball, because the Dowager Lady Cressit had decreed it. There had not been one at Vauncey in 7 years, not since the young Duke's father and elder brother had gone over in the Marbury floodwater in a carriage that should never have been put on that road, and the county had come to expect nothing of the house but silence. So the county came, on the 11th of January, in 11 carriages and a hard frost, to look at what was left. What the county did not know was that its host was not in the receiving line. He was in the passage behind the supper room, in a footman's coat that did not fit him across the shoulders, carrying a tray. Alaric, Duke of Vauncey, was 32, and looked older, in the way of men who have been careful for a long time. His face had been a good-looking face before somebody went over it with a plane and took all the give out of it. He had been 7 years a duke, and in that time nobody had told him a single thing he could rely on, because every word spoken to him was spoken to the title, and he had come at last to the position of a man who cannot taste his food and goes on eating out of habit. So he had borrowed a coat off a footman who was ill, and had gone down into his own ball to hear what a room said when it did not know he was in it. He heard a great deal. He heard a baronet's wife say, without lowering her voice, that the house was a mausoleum, and the master a monk, and the whole thing a waste of a fortune. He heard his own cousin explain to 3 people that the estate was mismanaged past saving. He was told to move by 4 separate persons who did not look at him while they said it, and he was sworn at by a young man over a spilled glass that the young man had spilled himself, and at 10 o'clock a gentleman took a plate off his tray without breaking off his sentence, and the sentence was about hounds. It was, he thought afterwards, the most instructive evening of his life, and the least surprising. He had expected all of it. He had not expected the woman at the end of the passage. She came out of the supper room at 11 with an empty urn in both arms, and she stopped when she saw him, and she looked at him, at his actual face, the way a person looks at somebody whose name they intend to remember. "You are the new man from Marbury," she said. "I am. Then somebody has given you Perrin's coat, and Perrin is 9 inches broader than you, and you will be miserable in it all night. Put the tray down a moment." She set the urn on the sill, and went into the linen cupboard, and came out with 2 pins, and turned his cuffs back, and pinned them, so the sleeves would not go into the sauce. "There, now, they will send you to the far end, because you are new, and the far end is where the draught is, and where nobody thanks anybody. Take the port up the west stair, and not the east. The east has a loose tread, and you will go down it with 11 glasses. And when you have carried that, come to the still room, and I will give you something to eat, because they will not think of it, and you have been on your feet since 7. He said, "You do not know me." "No," said Honor Verney. "But you are the person carrying the tray, and I have been the person carrying the tray for 6 years, and it is not a thing anybody should have to be lonely at." She picked up the urn and went, and the Duke of Vauncey stood in a cold passage in another man's coat, with his cuffs pinned, and found that his eyes were not entirely under his command, which had not happened to him in 7 years. Old Amos Rudge, the under-butler, 68 and long past the stairs, saw the whole of it from the pantry door, and thought that in 40 years of service he had never once seen a woman of that house stop for a footman on a ball night, and kept the thought where he kept everything. What Honor Verney had not told anybody in 6 years was that she had money, and that it was not much, and it was not hers. Her father had been Silas Verney, glazier and plumber of Marbury, and he had been finished in the year 23 at a coroner's inquest over the flood, when a gentleman named Mr. Peregrine Thoit had stood up and said, mildly, regretfully, that the ironwork on the Marbury Bridge parapet had been Verney's contract and Verney's failure, and had been uneasy about it at the time. It was not true. It was said pleasantly, and it was not true, and it took her father 14 months to die of it, and he left her nothing but a folding boxwood rule with a brass hinge worn smooth by 20 years of his thumb, and one saying she had heard since she could walk. Measure it twice, and write the number down, and then no frightened man alive can talk it out of you. She had come into service at Vauncey under her mother's name, which was Verney, her father's having been Verney Ash on all the plates and papers. She had come because the man who held the building and repair work for that estate at £110 a year was Mr. Peregrine Thoit. 6 years, and she had £11 saved out of her wages in a tin under a loose board, and a book in her own hand in which she had written, every quarter for 6 years, what she could see with her own eyes. The state of the east front lead, measured at the gutter with her father's rule. The dates the men came and did not come. The tally of what she was told had been spent. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. He came back to the still room the next morning, in his own coat, and she knew him at once, and did not curtsy, and said, "You had better stand out of that draught. The door does not shut," and went on with the pans. She said afterwards she had known from the pins, which was not true. She had known from the way he stood, which was like a man in somebody else's clothes. What she did not do was apologize, or color, or take back a word of it, and he stood in that room for 40 minutes, and was not once told that his loss had not been his fault. He came back on the Thursday, and then on the Monday, and by the end of February 3 mornings a week, and it was never called anything at all, and what they did was work. He held the ladder while she got at the gutter with the rule. He learned to hand her the muslin. He asked her in the 3rd week what the lead had cost when it was last done, and she said it had not been done, and he said his books showed £440 for it in 6 years, and she went and got a small ruled book from under a loose board, and put it on the table in front of him and said, "Then somebody has been writing you a story. Here are the numbers. I have measured that gutter 11 times in 6 years, and the wet across the beam ends has moved 4 inches. And here are the dates." He read it standing up, and did not speak for a long time. 1 second, 2, 3, and then he said, "Why did you never bring this to anybody?" "Because I am a housemaid," said Honor, "and because the man who would have been asked to comment on it is the man who wrote the story, and because there is a thing about me you had better know before you read another line." And she told him about her father, and the inquest, and the bridge, and the name she was not using, and finished by saying that if he thought she had come into his house under false colors, he had better turn her off that morning, and she would not argue. He said, "My father and my brother went into that flood water." "I know," said Honor. "That is why I came. Mr. Peregrine Thoit came for the quarter in the last week of March. He was 50 and pink and pleasant, and smiled a great deal. It was the same muscle. He found her in the still room, Miss Verney, or Verney Ash, as the Marbury plates have it. He picked up a jar and set it down. Silas Verney's girl, in service in this house, 6 years under half a name, keeping a private book on the fabric. You will be asked what you are, my dear, and you will say a housemaid, and then somebody will look at the plate cupboard and at how convenient it is that the only person in this house who writes anything down is a woman with a grievance and £11 in a tin. His Grace holds his audit on the 9th of May. Be gone before it, and there is nothing said at all. She had 6 weeks, and she used them at night, with the still room door bolted, and one tallow candle, because a half-built case can be laughed away, and a finished one cannot. She measured the gutter twice more, and wrote the numbers. She walked 11 miles to Marbury on her half-day, and got from the plumber there, in his own hand, and signed, that no lead work had been done at Vauncey since the year 19. She got the timber merchant's tally of what had gone out of the Vauncey woods in 6 years, and set it beside what the clean book owned. She got the marks of 4 labourers who had carried tarred canvas onto that roof, unpaid in the dry summer of 26. And she got, laid open on the still room bench by the Duke himself, the estate account for the year 23, with £61 entered and paid in the March, for the renewal of the parapet ironwork on the Marbury Bridge, 4 months before the flood, and no ironwork had ever gone up. She copied the whole of it fair, twice, and checked her columns twice, and said the totals out loud to the empty room, because a number said out loud cannot be argued away by a frightened man. The audit sat in the long gallery, on the 9th of May, 61 men at the tables, and the servants standing at the back, and the pails taken away for the day. Thoit began it beautifully. He had a duty that gave him no pleasure. There was a woman in the household serving under a curtailed name. Her father had been found culpable in the matter of the Marbury Bridge, where 3 people had died, one of them his Grace's own father. She had kept a private book on the fabric of a house she had no standing whatever to survey, and he was very sorry, extremely sorry, and supposed nobody could be blamed but the woman herself, since it was in the nature of such people to get in where they could. 61 faces turned. Honor Verney stood up, and found that the dread of a thing is nearly always larger than the thing. Every word Mr. Thoit has said is true, she said, and her voice went the length of that gallery, without her lifting it at all. My name is Honor Verney Ash. My father was Silas Verney, glazier and plumber of Marbury, and he was ruined at an inquest by that gentleman's opinion, and died of it 14 months after. I came into this house under half my name to find out whether the opinion could be proved false. I did not tell His Grace until March. That was cowardice, and I do not defend it. And since I am to be looked at today, you shall have the rest of it. The east front lead has not been touched since the year 19, and the plumber at Marbury has written it out and signed it, and £440 stands charged for it in 6 years. 4 men who carried canvas onto that roof unpaid have made their marks, and £61 stands entered and paid in this estate's book, in the March of the year 23, for the renewal of the parapet ironwork on the Marbury Bridge, and here is the ironmonger's book, and no ironwork was ever ordered, and no ironwork was ever set, and the parapet that gave way in the July was the old one. Nobody in that gallery said anything, because everybody in it had been at the funeral, and Peregrine Thoit laughed. It was small and pleasant, and it was the worst thing he could have done, and he knew it before it was out of his mouth, because no man laughs at a column of figures. And in the silence after it, the Duke of Vauncey came the whole length of that room, past 61 people, and stood beside a housemaid, and said, to the table, in the flattest voice in England, "The lady has my accounts because I gave them to her." And in January, I carried a tray in this house for 4 hours, and one person in it spoke to me as though I were a man. She is standing here. Send for the ironmonger. What followed took until dark, and was not lovely. There was a night in June, when the Duke stood with a pen, and every intention of writing to 9 men who would have finished Thoit by Michaelmas. And Honor put her hand flat on the paper. "Send him to the law, and not one letter," she said. "He can answer at the bench, where there are figures and witnesses, and a man may reply." But my father was finished by a pleasant remark at an inquest with nothing behind it that could be weighed, and I will not start that same thing over in the other direction and call it justice because it happens to be my turn. And he did it because he was frightened of being poor. I have been frightened of being poor for 6 years, and I did secret things about it too. Mine happened to be honest. That is luck as much as virtue, and I am not sure enough of the difference to stand over any man and enjoy it. So it went to the assizes, and Thoit made restitution of about 1/3, and the Duke made up the rest out of his own pocket, and counted it cheaply bought. He wrote to the coroner and the bench at Marbury over his own name and seal, laying the bridge business before them entire, and in the October, the finding against Silas Verney was withdrawn as unfounded, and he had it printed in the Marbury paper, and paid for it, and set the sheet across the still-room table without a word. Honor read it twice, and went out and walked in the wet park for an hour by herself, and nobody followed her, which was the kindest thing done for her that year. He waited until the lead was renewed, and the money settled, and her father's name was his own again, so that there should be nothing left between them that could be mistaken for a debt. And then he came to the still room in November, with his sleeves already back. "There is nothing owing," he said. "Lady Cressit has offered you a place here for life, whatever you say to me, and has undertaken to outlive me if I make you uncomfortable in it. So I am asking a free woman." He turned the boxwood rule over in his hands. "You pinned my cuffs when I was nobody. I have thought about that a great deal, and I find it is the only thing anybody has done for me in 7 years that was not done for the coronet. Will you marry me?" "On one condition," she said. "Name it." "Amos Rudge does no more stairs. He is 68, and he saw what happened in that passage in January, and never said a word to a living soul, and he is to be pensioned properly, and told that I know he knew." A year on, in the January, Vauncey gave its ball again, and the state rooms were open, and the gilding in the long gallery had been done, and the east front was dry. Somewhere near 11, the Duchess of Vauncey left the receiving line and went out into the passage behind the supper room, and found a new young man from Marbury struggling under a tray in a coat 9 inches too broad, and she put down what she was carrying and turned his cuffs back and pinned them. A house is not known by its plate or its candles. It is known by what it says to the person carrying the tray, and most houses do not know they are being asked the question. That is precisely why the answer is worth having. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.